I don't like the term bravery. Objectively, it's not a bad word, but I don't like how casually it gets thrown around, especially when people find out that I was an orphan. It's funny, isn't it, how words can evoke certain feelings and certain reactions from us. How do you feel when somebody describes you? I suppose that for most of us, it depends on the context. If somebody that you like and admire calls you pretty, it feels really good. But if somebody that you just met at a bus stop calls you pretty, it's really creepy. Maybe you wouldn't mind being called brave. Maybe it would make you feel good. Maybe it would make you feel like you had achieved something. Well, what exactly did I achieve by being adopted? Like you, I have a loving family. The only difference is that I lost a family first. But none of that was my choice. I want to be called brave for my choices, not for the choices made by other people. As a precursor to this talk, I want to clarify that intention does not trump impact. So if you catch yourself saying things like, maybe she's being a bit sensitive, or, but I'm sure that was meant well, I want to know, do you feel like your intention is more important than the way that I feel? Do you think that your priority is not to hurt other people, or is it to not acknowledge that you've hurt other people? Now, everybody has labels thrown on them, and it's hard not to feel like we've been boxed into a corner. And it's harder still when people say these things with really big smiles on their faces, completely ignorant to the ways in which labels can reduce you. I can't possibly fit my entire story into this talk, but I would like to talk about my realization that my labels have become more like expectations than definitions. Do I consider myself to be brave? I'm still deciding on that. A common label that I hear about adoption is that it's beautiful. Now, I know that not many people know much about adoption. It's not widely discussed beyond the success stories and the signed papers. And media coverage heavily focuses on the experience for adoptive parents. So I want to know why adoptee perspectives are so rare, why this might possibly be your first time listening to an adoptee talk about their experience. Like many things, adoption is a heavily nuanced subject. And like many things, adoption is usually portrayed in a very one-sided manner. Now, I want to set the record straight. I love my parents, and I am grateful that they adopted me. But too often, I've found that my trauma is mistaken for a lack of gratitude. In fact, when I've spoken honestly and openly, people have criticized me for not being dutiful enough to my parents. My parents aren't the ones criticizing me. They're actually here right now. However, when it comes to adoption, there is still a very superficial understanding in society of what that actually means. There is this misconception that any suffering is somehow cancelled out once the orphan has found a home. But that's just not true. You see, I gained a family, but I also lost a family. And I carry that loss with me every day. I carry that loss with me when I meet somebody new and I have to explain why my parents are white and I'm not. I carry that loss with me when I try and speak Chinese so badly, clumsily tripping in this language that should have been my mother tongue. And I carry that loss with me with every celebration and every achievement, silently acknowledging this family that doesn't even know who I am anymore. I can never escape that loss. And if you call adoption beautiful, you expect that it can be no less than that. So I'd like you to consider that perhaps my trauma deserves more context than simply the word beautiful. Another word that gets thrown around is brave, but ironically, it's not always aimed at me. My parents have been called brave for adopting a child that isn't theirs. Some people have even called me damaged goods. Yikes. My parents are no braver than any other family for bringing more love into the world. My parents are brave for their values, for building themselves up and for building their children even higher, and for championing those who cannot champion themselves. But by saying that they are brave simply for adopting me, you're implying that you don't really consider me to be theirs. And I'm sure that that's not what you really mean, but that's how it can be heard. Words are like that sometimes. People don't always hear what you want them to. And as an adoptee, I have been given many unwanted and backhanded compliments. Things like, "Really? You seem so stable." Or, "God, you are so brave." But the most common compliment that doesn't sit well with me is, "You must be so grateful. You are so lucky that your parents saved you," or something to that effect. Why do people always see what I have gained and ignore what I have lost? I didn't consent to this trauma. Maybe we should focus on whether I'm lucky or whether the world has too many children and not enough families. When we use words like brave and lucky, we put the onus on the individual instead of on society. Maybe we should consider whether I'm brave, or if the world is just unfair. Maybe you could consider if I'm lucky, or whether having a family is the least that every child deserves. When I talk about adoption, I talk about it on my terms. But sometimes people don't like conversational boundaries. And I wonder, is that because they feel entitled to my trauma? Adoption is one of the only forms of intimate trauma that is treated so casually by those who are simply curious. Why is it that strangers feel like they can come up to me, indulge their curiosities, and I'm expected to oblige? It is a subject where questions are posed without thought and without consideration for the adoptee. I've had people come up to me, and say, very seriously, "Ali, have you ever considered trying to find your biological parents?" Oh my God, whoa, what a revelation. 26 years and that never crossed my mind? Have you guys ever seen Harry Potter? The orphans always get the best arcs. But the bit that Netflix misses out is that being an orphan isn't glamorous. And 99% of the interactions that you have romanticize one of the worst things that ever happened to you. But it's okay because it's character development. For example, an ex-girlfriend of mine who went to one of the most prestigious private schools in the UK once said to me that she was jealous of my trauma because it made my life exciting. Now, I don't know about you, but she seemed completely oblivious to her privilege and chose to romanticize my trauma like it was some sort of quirk. But in all seriousness, I'd like to clarify that I've not done a 23andMe. I don't need to, and I don't feel the need to go off on a quest to find my family anytime soon. In all honesty, being an orphan does not mean that your boundaries are negotiable simply because other people are curious and want to save you. As you've probably realized, I'm very interested in dissecting labels. And that is not because I desperately need to find them. It's because they are plastered on me every time I walk into a room. Now, I know that we've covered the fact that I'm adopted, but don't worry, that's not going anywhere. I'm also Asian and therefore brown. In fact, it might be easier to come out with all my labels right now. I am a queer, disabled, orphaned person of color. So you can imagine how popular I am when it comes to fulfilling a diversity quota. If you buy one, you get 4 for free. And if you think that people are excited at the prospect of talking to an adoptee, you can only imagine how much more excited they get when they find out that I'm also married to a woman. Woo! Cue rapid-fire rounds of invasive questions. Which one of you is the guy in this female-female relationship? Which one of you changes the light bulbs? Not to be awkward, but how do you guys do it? Well, the answer is usually better than you, I imagine. What I really enjoy, though, is when people try and be inclusive in their interrogation, and they ask me, Ali, did being an orphan turn you gay? Now, I did talk to some of my adoptee friends about this, and I can't lie, a lot of us are queer. But that's just because we have good taste. Now, I'm sorry that there isn't any more scientific backing to this, but the idea that my sexuality is somehow a flaw caused by my trauma is a very diminishing view of same-sex relationships. My sexuality isn't caused by loss or pain, it's informed by love. In fact, I don't really consider myself brave for being fabulous and coming out, with my sexuality, because I really didn't have a choice. And I am blissfully happy and married. In fact, my wife, hey baby, is sitting right there. She's the hot one. Maybe in being queer, the world does expect certain things from me, but the only thing that my wife expects from me is to just be myself. And I think that's beautiful. Now, it's hard to navigate a world that already has so many expectations of who you are without your consent. When people hear my numerous labels, they have all these preconceived notions about the kind of person that I am. But about 3 years ago, perceptions of who I am changed drastically when I was diagnosed with ADHD. So I received a new label, woo, upgrade. And with that, of course, I had always had ADHD, I just didn't know it. But receiving that label came with a new set of expectations. And I wonder, why is it that prior to my diagnosis, my struggles were considered failures? All my school reports said exactly the same thing. Ali is bright, but just needs to work harder. Ali needs to focus. Ali needs to apply herself to achieve her potential. Imaginary potential. Now, they also made the comment that due to my difficult background, I was, all things considered, doing quite well. So all of my achievements and my successes were seen as either in spite of a difficult background or because of a fortunate background. Ultimately, they weren't about me. Maybe if I hadn't been adopted, my struggles would have been taken more seriously as signs of a disability instead of assumed to be a byproduct of trauma. Another aspect in my very late diagnosis is the fact that almost all medical research on ADHD focuses exclusively on boys. Now, girls who are seen as distractible and chatty often struggle far more than is obvious, but they're dismissed as ditzy yet lovable. And in the same way that adoption can often be glamorized, I find that disabilities can be romanticized. And I've had friends and colleagues and even strangers come up to me and say, hey, Ali, I think I'm a bit ADHD too. And just like unwanted compliments, this can sometimes feel a bit dismissive. Now, do I consider myself brave for persevering despite my disability? No, not really. I have 2 degrees. I work for PwC, which is scary. And by all accounts, I am a success story. People have called me brave for #breaking the bias. But I don't consider myself brave for just being myself. Like everybody else, I'm just trying to survive. My final example of a label that has been applied in my life is inspirational. Now, over the past 2 years, we have been plagued with a worldwide pandemic. Did anybody else notice that? Good, I thought it was just me. And during this pandemic, hate crimes towards East Asian people rose rapidly by over 360%. And things escalated to the point where people were getting physically attacked. In Edinburgh, several people were attacked, including me. Things got to the point where something just needed to be done, and we couldn't stay silent and scared any longer. So my friend Faye and I co-founded an organization called Racism Unmasked, some of the members are here right now. Hey guys. But was this decision born out of bravery? I don't really think so. What choice did we have in the face of hostility and prejudice? In fact, I reject the idea that co-founding Racism Unmasked was an act of bravery, because it implies that I just woke up one day and thought freely, yep, you know what, that's what I'm going to do today. What choice did we have? It's not a free choice if the alternative is violence and oppression. People would come up to me in the streets and say, "Oi, go back to China." But here's the really crazy part. When I explained that I was English and adopted, they backtracked. Does that make me less Asian somehow? Does being adopted make me more tolerable? In anti-racism, there's a notion of othering, where people are described in terms that either include or exclude them. For example, I've had very well-meaning loved ones tell me, "You know, Ali, I don't even see you as Chinese anymore. I don't see color. You're just one of us." And examples of these microaggressions are pervasive for people of color, even if they're well-intended. On the one hand, I'm not considered native enough to be Chinese, but I'm also not white enough to be British, so I live somewhere in between. I face racism from those with bad intentions, but I also face racism from those with good intentions. And the label of inspirational implies that I'm somehow expected to be stronger and better than all of this. I'm expected not only to hold my trauma, but also to hold space to educate others. Working as a leader in anti-racism, I'm expected to react perfectly, patiently, and endlessly. Does this make me brave? Or does this put yet another box around me? So much work in anti-racism relies heavily on free labor from people of color. We need to focus less on praising the individual and more on criticizing the society that creates these circumstances. If you call me an inspiration, but you don't do anything to implement any real, structural changes, then what use is it for me to be called inspiring? We should focus less on reposting the occasional Instagram tile and more on addressing racism on a day-to-day basis. Ultimately, words like this, words like brave, beautiful, interesting, inspiring, persevering, they don't seem like bad words. They're not bad words, but when they're only words, they don't hold much weight. When words are used, but actions are not taken, it can feel hollow and disingenuous. My issue isn't with labels, it's with the expectations attached to them. My problem is with the ways in which people use labels to restrict, diminish, and lessen their individual responsibility to address problems in the world. It's so much easier, don't you think, to fling labels from afar than to consider your individual impact. So the next time that you encounter an orphan, I want you to remember that maybe labels aren't necessary, but kindness and compassion are. I'd like you to remember that your curiosity comes second to their comfort and their boundaries. And finally, I want to urge anyone who can relate to the things that I've talked about to understand that you have the power to redefine any labels on your own terms. And nobody can take that away from you. That's your power. We can choose to stand up and speak for ourselves. We can choose autonomy. We can choose us. And it doesn't matter how uncomfortable it makes other people feel, because if they have an issue with your boundaries, it's because they benefit from crossing them. Now, I chose to come here today to stand up and speak with you all and reclaim my power because I wanted to. 1 second. Does this choice make me brave? Yes, I think it does. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.